Welcome to the sixth week of the African History Through the Lens of Economics teaching initiative that Nathan Nunn, Stelios Michalopoulos, Leonard Wantchekon, and me have curated and put together. Let me say once more that we're very pleased with your active participation. Thanks big time for your kind words and the constant emails that we're receiving. And we look forward, let's say, to the second half of this course. So today, we will start our journey and discuss mostly economics research, trying to assess the various impacts of the colonialism in Africa. Many of you have already posed questions in the previous sessions when we zoomed on the slave trades and the scramble for Africa and pre-colonial Africa about what has been the impact of colonization in various parts of the continent. And over the past 3 weeks, we will try to shed some light, building again on a very recent economics research on the topic. Today, my great friend, Leonard Wantchekon, and I will try to do some introduction to place the huge amount of work in economics, but also related fields like political science and history and cultural anthropology on the topic. And then starting actually later with Leonard, and also tomorrow and the week, we will try to zoom on particular aspects of colonization. Let me introduce also Mamello Selamolela, a dear friend. Mamello is based in Johannesburg, where she works for Vodacom. She is the managing executive there at their strategy and innovation group. Mamello is a graduate of the University of Cape Town with a degree in economics, and we are very proud as London Business School to call her one of us as she completed her master's in business administration a couple of years ago. Besides, let me also say that Mamello is very active with the London Business School alumni community. For example, she helps us every year when Rajesh Chandy and I work with a team of London Business School students together with micro-entrepreneurs in Alexandra in Joburg, in Johannesburg. So Mamello and Leonard, thanks. So the structure of the lecture today, I will start giving an overview of colonization in economics research, and then I will pass the baton to Leonard, who will try to zoom more on education and human capital kind of investments and lay the ground for what it will come up. As always, please start using the Zoom facility, send us questions. Mamello will collect many of them. My colleagues will try to address some of them in the live chat, and we will devote something like half an hour at least to discuss those questions. And those that we will not be able to address, as always, in the weekly Q&A, we will prepare more elaborate and more detailed answers. Mamello, thanks a lot for being with us. Let me share my slides, please. Today, in the next 20-25 minutes, I want to give an overview of how research in economics have tried to shed some light about the impact of colonization in Africa. Now, it is actually relatively straightforward to motivate this, and as I mentioned already, many of you have been posing questions on this issue. But simply tabulating proxies of well-being going back to the 11th, 10th century clearly shows that during the time that has been coined as the commercial revolution, spurred by transatlantic trade, the boom of Europe and then of North America, during this time, actually, Africa, quote unquote, is being left behind. We discussed a lot about what happened in the continent from the 16th to the 18th, 19th century, when Nathan Nunn and Pat Manning delved into the issue of the slave trades. So now we go to the period of colonization that, as Stelios Michalopoulos briefly discussed last week, starts roughly speaking in 1860, perhaps 1885 is the key date with the infamous Berlin Conference that partitioned or laid the ground for the partitioning and the carving of the continent. But as you can see here, something is happening that keeps Africa behind while pushes Europe and North America to fast growth. So this is zooming in the period from 1820 till today, again, very slow growth in Africa, while at the same time, much stronger growth in Europe and other parts of the world. And effectively, what's happening, so at some point, for example, Brazil is comparable to China, India, and African countries, but we have the takeoff of Latin America. Well, again, African countries, also China and India, actually, during that time, are experiencing very slow economic growth. So if I was to sum up, when colonization starts, the average person in sub-Saharan Africa, his or her income was something like a third of the average income of the average person residing in the US at the time. And actually, by the end of colonization, by 1950s, when African countries start obtaining independence, where the income of the average African is something like a tenth or even 1 out of 20 of the income of the average American or the average Western European. So these are like large differences that get magnified during this time. Now, many of you have already been posing questions, which actually, I would say, very influential scholars and very smart people across social sciences have tried to address. What is the impact of colonization? Actually, we zoom in Africa and various parts of Africa, but, the same question could be posed, for example, about Latin America, about India, about many other parts. Now, as it will become clear in the next 2-3 weeks, actually tackling this question from an economics viewpoint is actually quite challenging because it's very hard to come up with a reasonable counterfactual. So how can we think about the world economy in the 17th to the early 20th century as having not this significant effect of colonization? True, we can find some places, for example, in Ethiopia and Liberia, where colonization was much shorter, or perhaps it was not even existent. But again, few will question that those two countries were immune, if you like, to imperialism as it was coined at the time. And of course, to come up with a counterfactual, with the answer to the counterfactual, we need to come up with a story of how African states that we discussed in lecture 2 and lecture 3 would have evolved in the absence of colonization. And actually, some influential scholars have argued that colonization was extremely deleterious to Africa because it hit at a time when we had the emergence of strong and somewhat efficient African states. An important caveat that we have already seen is that we tend to discuss a lot about colonization, but actually in the preceding to African colonization period, we saw that Africa suffered deeply from the African slave trades. So actually the influence of Europeans and imperial powers to Africa actually precedes colonization, at least in the case of Africa. Now, the way that economics research has tried to come up with this issue, as it will become clearer with Leonard and our guests in the following weeks, is effectively during colonization, many things happen in Africa. And again, we will zoom here on Africa, but the same kind of discussion would apply had we studied colonization in Latin America or elsewhere. First of all, we had very extractive institutional arrangement, forced labor, slavery, a lot of oppression, colonial violence, native or indirect rule in some parts and not in others. Well, at the same time, the imperial powers did build some roads and railroads and a bit some ports, so there was some infrastructure development, actually quite less, much less actually than what people had anticipated at the time. As Leonard will discuss later, there were some human capital investments, a build-up of schools, of some primary health facilities. Of course, a huge influence of colonization on the trajectory of African countries' economic development has been what has been coined as dependency, in the sense that African countries specialized in some goods that European powers were in need at the time, and perhaps there was significant inertia on that. Of course, the politics and the political economy, the economic power altered during the colonial times and actually in the preceding slave trades period, and these had lasting impacts on the continent. So effectively, economics research has been trying to come up and study those features kind of in isolation, but At the same time, studying also perhaps heterogeneous effects, let's say, of Christian missionary schools or railroads and roads or ports. And heterogeneity could be across place, across religious affiliation, ethnic groups, rural, urban, many other aspects. And of course, the research that we will cover has focused on all main periods of colonization, although I think it's fair to say that most of economic research has been on the early colonial period. We have not seen much work actually on late colonial period. Actually, Leonard, in a couple of weeks, will discuss some very fascinating work he has on the type of independence movements and their impact on subsequent political development in Africa. Now, any introductory lecture on African colonization needs to start, at least in my view, with some broad classifications. And let me start with a caveat here that most of those classifications are Eurocentric. Yeah, they take the viewpoint of the colonial power rather than of the African societies that were greatly and adversely impacted by imperialism. So an old tradition in political science tends to distinguish between British or common law kind of countries and non-British, in the case of Africa, mostly French civil law kind of countries. There is very fascinating research in economics by Andrei Schleifer and a very big team of economists documenting across the world sizable differences between British common law countries and French and German civil law countries across a variety of relevant for economics outcomes. The regulation of capital markets, of labor markets, of product markets, corruption, guarantees of freedom in the constitution, investor protection, bankruptcy, and many others. In the case of Africa, this distinction perhaps is somewhat relevant in the sense that the British applied way more kind of indirect rule kind of strategies when they were ruling the interior vis-a-vis the French or other colonial powers that applied the much more direct rule, hands-on kind of approach. Now, a second, again, a kind of classification, which I want to discuss in more detail shortly, has been put forward by Jim Robinson, Simon Johnson, and Daron Acemoglu, very influential political science and economists, who argued that we can think of two very extreme modes of colonization. Very extractive, and actually many African countries would fit into this paradigm, where we had very small European communities with the objective of those colonies or protectorates to extract resources, to extract, let's say, minerals or agricultural produce, ship them to industrializing Americas or to industrializing Europe. Then in some other parts of the world, not necessarily in Africa, because this is a global, if you like, conjecture, Europeans established, quote unquote, relatively more inclusive institutions. There they established larger communities, and since they migrated en masse, they didn't establish very extractive norms and institutions because those institutions that were transplanted had at least some ideas of protection, for example, of private property and safeguarding, for example, civil liberties. Now, perhaps zooming more into Africa, a very influential conjecture, actually I would say not in economics, but actually in African studies and policy science, actually comes from an Egyptian Marxist political scientist / economist, Samir Amin, who roughly categorized colonial Africa into three broad categories. The Africa of the colonial concession companies, for example, in French or Belgian Congo or in parts of Central Africa, where actually colonization was outsourced to private corporations that ruled the interior, raising capital from European capitals and actually ruling the interior ruthlessly. We have the traditional West Africa, Cameroon, and perhaps some other countries where we had relatively rich coastal regions, and then, for example, in Ghana, the Northern Territory served as labor reserve, supplying much needed labor into the Asante region in the center and Gold Coast in the south. And then we had the Africa of the labor reserves, for example, parts of Mozambique, actually, they were used to recruit labor to go and work in the silver mines and the subsequent mines developed and found in Johannesburg. Now, Gareth Austin has put a kind of similar classification distinguishing between colonies and protectorates with sizable or small or something in between size of Europeans. And there is some interesting research in economics more recently by Ross Levine and Bill Easterly, who will host later, showing that in those places where we had kind of larger European communities, there seems to be somewhat higher levels of economic development today. Now, Jim Robinson and Leander Hendring actually take also a classification that is closer to Africa and effectively distinguish between three sets of colonies. Those where strong centralized states had already emerged before European colonization commences. And a very good example of that is Botswana, where already we had the Tswana kingdom already being developed. Ethiopia clearly is another case where King Menelik actually defeated the Europeans. We had other colonies with significant white settlement, for example, the southern part of Mozambique close to contemporary Maputo, or parts of Zimbabwe and South Africa, parts of Namibia, and then the rest that are classified as having both relatively small European influence, but in those regions, for example, in Sierra Leone, we hadn't seen, at least to the best of our knowledge, very sophisticated and developed African states or empires. Let me continue with some caveats. Obviously, this is very, very coarse. And as Chris Ehret discussed in the very first lecture, and I think as Leonard discussed in the special lecture that we had with him, we clearly need more and more research on those issues, because sadly, we do not know that much about pre-colonial Africa as we would like to know as social scientists and as people who care about the continent. So let me now take 5 minutes, or perhaps 7 minutes, and discuss an extremely influential conjecture put forward by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, I would say now 20 years ago, that in some sense, alongside the work of Laporta, Lopez Densilan, Schleifer, and Wisny, set the seeds and put fertilizer, if you like, to a younger generation of economists that took those ideas into a much more micro and causal identification kind of viewpoint. So Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson effectively put forward the following idea about the role of colonization in explaining nowadays large differences in economic development. If you recall from lecture 1, Nathan Nunn mentioned that if you take the richest to poorest country nowadays, even if you drop outliers, some small countries that do phenomenally well or not so well, we talk about differences in the range of 25, even 30 to 1. If one was to go back in time and go in the beginning of the colonial times, those differences were 3 to 1, 4 to 1, clearly way smaller than what we observed. So effectively, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson thought that something must have happened during this time, the Great Divergence period, and colonization was actually, what clearly impacted both Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and many parts of the world. So if I was to provide a schematic representation, this would be as follows. In some parts of the world, Europeans were very extractive. And in some other parts of the world, European imperial powers were less extractive. When we say inclusive here, everything has to be thought through the lens of the pervasive ideology at the time. So we had a spectrum of very extractive colonies and not so much extractive colonies. Now, those institutions that Europeans set up during colonization also shaped political power during colonization. So then we have independence in Latin America in 1820s, 1830s, in Africa a century later, in India after World War II. But those institutions, and especially the distribution of economic and political power persisted. And because of this persistence, what happened in the colonial times matters for today, for the institutions today. Think about the quality of the bureaucracy, how corrupt or honest administrators are, how efficient courts are, regulatory capacity, investor protection, shareholders' rights, creditors' rights, and more. And through this mechanism, we see nowadays large differences in economic development across the world. Of course, the next question is why on earth, in some places, Europeans applied strategy A, and in some other parts of the world, Europeans applied strategy B, and in some other places, a hybrid of A or B. So the next step of their conjecture was that the living conditions that Europeans faced in other parts of the world where they migrated en masse actually was a crucial feature. The disease environment, opposition from the locals, various other geographic or ecological kind of conditions, those were key driving forces of the type of colonization and the size of European settlements. Let me not delve into that. I'm sure that we will get questions, and perhaps with Mamello and Leonard we discussed during the Q&A. So effectively, settler mortality, the mortality that European settlers faced, which in itself was a function of the disease environment, ecology, location, opposition from the locals, various issues, was a key influencing factor of the colonial strategy, inclusive or extractive. And of course, this is not binary. We can have a lot of heterogeneity and variation with it. So this is effectively the summary. And here we are some challenges which I guess we'll discuss later. There are measurement issues here. There are issues about mechanisms. One could reasonably argue that, look, the disease environment not only affects development by shaping the colonial strategy, but has direct effects, let's say, on economic development by affecting, how much hours, for example, people can work, which is a very straightforward challenge. But Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson compiled some data on settler mortality using newspaper information at the time, and they effectively revealed as a first set of results that in those places where settler mortality was high for Europeans, in those places you have relatively weak institutions today. This is in 2000, but the same would apply today. While conversely, in places where it was easy for Europeans to migrate because their mortality rates were low, actually today you see high levels of institutional capacity here as proxied in a composite rule of law index. The same applies with GDP. So in places where you had high levels of mortality rates, you have, relatively speaking, economic underdevelopment as reflected with GDP. And conversely, in places with low settler mortality, high levels of economic development. Similarly, one could proxy the conditions that Europeans faced with population density, roughly speaking, in the 15th, 16th century. And one again gets similar kind of correlations that in places with low population density, it was easier for Europeans to migrate because they didn't find a large kingdom to oppose them, for example. So there was a lot of land. So it was very few people. So it was easier for Europeans to migrate and set up a farm, for example. So likewise, you see a similar negative association between rule of law today, like a proxy of institutional quality today, and what happened population-wise before colonization. So effectively, they develop a statistical technique that combines these two sets of results. And effectively, the flagship result here is that the component, if you like, of national institutions that reflect the colonial strategy, settler mortality or population density, is a strong correlate of economic development. So this effectively is their three kind of results. So what can we take now out of it? This work has been massively criticized on various grounds, but taking a constructive viewpoint is that we can take as given that the strategies of the imperial powers were clearly different. from an economist viewpoint, it kind of makes sense that geological, ecological, geographic features matter, in the sense that the colonial strategy was not a random event. It was driven by some economic kind of consideration. And then we have also a very interesting story connecting the past to today. And this comes through the role of political power and economic power that appears very, very much persistent. We will discuss, for example, later in the lecture, a fascinating follow-up study by Daron Acemoglu, Jim Robinson, and Tristan Reed, showing in the case of Sierra Leone, they go into the micro and they trace the development and the evolution of political power, showing strong inertia from the time of British rule up until today. So how can we now progress? Obviously, stories like the one I discussed are very broad, they're very controversial, but it's very hard to prove for many actually straightforward reasons. We don't have that many countries to start with. There are severe data issues. Perhaps we have better data, let's say, from one part of the world vis-a-vis some other parts of the world. Clearly, ecology, geography can impact economic development directly. And in any case, these stories is not about why we see significant variation in economic performance across African countries, or even within African countries across regions. There are very macro scale kind of conjectures to explain, for example, why Latin America is doing worse than North America, but somewhat better than Africa. So effectively, the way we can progress is to quote unquote unbundle colonization, break down, if you like, the colonial treatment into its various components: institutions, direct versus indirect rule, oppression, violence, prison labor, conscription. I'm sure that you can add more. Human capital investments, arguably, there were not that many, but clearly they had influence. By missions, by the colonial administration, there were medical campaigns. Transportation infrastructure, some roads and some railroads especially were built, not as many as people have thought actually at the time. Taxation mattered a lot, and we will have a special session on exactly the issue of colonial taxation. And the structure of the economy actually will turn out to have significant lasting consequences. So in the next 3 weeks, both in the main and in the special lectures, we will try to cover economics research on those issues that in some sense you may worry, oh, this is going to be narrower, because the research that we will cover will not be about the big question, how deleterious colonization was to African economic, political, and social development, but it will be about colonial institutions and effectively direct or indirect rule. But we will be able to advance on causation and study heterogeneity. What we will take is we will take this historical approach, good data. I'm sure that you will complain, but there's going to be more and more emphasis in getting better and better data. Political economic considerations will be there, so we will have to study the evolution of economic and political power from the colonial time, and perhaps even from the preceding slave trade period up until today. And actually institutions, the rules of the game, as Doug North, a Nobel laureate in economics, has coined them, actually, they are going to be relatively slow moving. And it's going to be important to try to think how the rules of the game have evolved from the colonial times till today. Of course, societies are also governed by informal rules related to the issues that Nathan, Ama, and Awa discussed in week 2, issues that we will be returning throughout in the next 3 weeks. We will mostly use micro approaches like the work that Leonard has done, or meso approaches, more like the stuff that Stelios and I have done, and many others, by the way. Using spatial data, individual data, and perhaps trying to combine some narratives with more quantitative kind of information. The challenge and the effort would be to say something causal about what would be, for example, the impact of building missionary schools or developing railroad infrastructure, how those early colonial investments or early colonial violence affects contemporary development. Does it affect trust, for example, as the work of Leonard and Nathan has shown in the case of the slave trades? We can use, and we will cover, very innovative research there. And of course, in the back of our head, there's always going to be the question, oh, why, for example, we see more Christian schools and more missionary schools, mostly on the coastline rather than the interior. So the origins, the political economy of that, coupled with geography, will feature prominently in their work that we will see. So let me pause here and pass the floor to Leonard. So we will start now discussing those, if you like, aspects of the colonial treatment, starting with the role of education and human capital more broadly defined issues with Leonard, and actually the session tomorrow with Catherine, Etienne, and Roland will zoom on the role of Christian missions. Leonard, the floor to you.
So thank you very much. So yeah, let me share my screen. Okay, yeah, have it. Okay, so I'll be focusing on education, human capital investment, particularly on education. And my presentation will be in basically 4 parts. First, I will introduce by discussing the motivations of colonial authorities in building schools. I'm going to describe some pattern in the data that Elias has referred to briefly. And then I'll talk about the impact, the socioeconomic impact, regional inequalities across gender, across regions or religions. And then there is something that we haven't talked about enough, which I think will be very important when we are talking about the independence movement in particular and the decolonization movement, which is empowerment, how African elites took advantage of the educational opportunity that was offered, to challenge, colonial rule. And then I will finish by some takeaway. So as a way of introduction, so by early 1900, there were growing issues with governance, particularly public administration and trade, that required educated Africans. And there were rules that allow the colonial administration to pay only a fraction that what was paid to colonial administrators, which makes educated African a relatively cheap source of labor. So, but then they face a dilemma, they feared, while they are building schools, they fear that educated Africans will demand more freedom when they met with the hard limits to social mobility and in colonial society. And this is based in part from the experience in India, where increased education led to basically movement against the colonial rule. So we didn't want to repeat the same mistake in Africa. Okay, let me come then to the patterns in the data on colonial education. There are 3 points I'm going to stress. One is that the investment in education were very small. But then despite that, as we'll see later, it has very important, sometimes massive effect on social mobility and political engagement. And Africans demanded more Western education, not less. And as I said early on, colonial power feared that education will threaten their control. So as I said earlier, again, primary education remained very scarce. So the education investment were made with no contribution to metropole. Investment tend to concentrate over time as marginal flow to areas where existing facility and locally high demand for education exists. And the low level of investment made were through grants to missionary school. And in turn, missionary schools were generally run on the initiative of Africans. So if you look at this table, you can see, for instance, that there were, like the numbers, government expenditure per person enrolled in primary education were, very low, 0.5 in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, 0.9. But look at this difference in Northern Rhodesia, for instance, starting in 2020, between the natives and the Europeans. It was more than, 20 or 40 times what was spent on Africans, actually far more. So it just shows the huge discrepancy between expenditure on natives, Africans, and on Europeans. So now, most of the education were done through missionary school. In Sierra Leone, for instance, 99% of the school were mission schools. In Northern Rhodesia, 100%. It shows that the colonial authority delegated much of the education, kind of running the schools to missionary. And this is another figure which I think is very interesting. Number of teachers were, basically the mean was 4 per 100 inhabitants from 1910 to 1928, and it was highly concentrated. It has evolved with the time, but from this figure, you have some impressive, I should say, increase from 1910 to 1950, maybe due to increasing return to that investment. I'm not sure, but the most, as I'll show later on, the most likely driver for this increase is higher demand for education by Africans. But what is also important to note is that these investments were highly concentrated in other areas. So then I'll come to regional disparities. There were large disparities, across regions. So schooling was concentrated in coastal areas or near the pre-colonial trading post. And so this is not only in the British Africa, but also in Francophone Africa as well. And this will drive regional disparity in the future, and regional inequality in the future. Okay, so there was something that's also really important to notice is despite the gender equity tradition in many parts of Africa, there was a massive gender inequality or gender discrimination, I should say, in access to education. In Nigeria, only 7.6% of the enrolled children in 1928 were girls. And in some places, actually, like Onitsha, it was less than 3%. So things have not changed drastically over time, because by 1950, most countries had primary school enrollment rate by less than 20%. So something which is also very important to note is the disparity in level, primary versus secondary education. So like in 1939, there was no secondary school in Central Africa. No, zero. So education policy was based on a pyramidal system, expanding primary school, but severely restricting access to secondary education. Because again, primary school will create a cheap labor force for the colonial administration, but then expanding to secondary school level will maybe lead to a breakdown of the colonial system, because Africans will demand more influence, more power, particularly politically, as we see in a second. Okay, so again, on gender discrimination, even in Nigeria, you can see that most of the schools were all boys' schools. you know. Okay, now let me talk about curriculum. It's very interesting because the goal of the Colonial Authority was to provide what they call practical rudimentary education, and turning young natives into workers who speak and write French. So that was a quote by the Lieutenant Governor of Senegal in 1903. And you know, there were a lot of kind of evidence suggesting that the curriculum was adapted to, you know, basically to serve the economic interest of the colonial rule, you know, through grants provided to mission schools and so on. Okay, so the model in Senegal is quite interesting. In cities, it was very different from where people were actually taught basic math, metrics, geometry, and so on. And but then in rural areas, it was mostly practical training in agriculture, so that woodwork and metalwork, you know. So it was really a very, you know, not two-tiered, but yeah, two-tiered education system. So in Nigeria, girls were limited, you know, girls' schools were limited, for instance, to learn domestic economy, cookery, bakery, needlework, and so on. Okay. So now let me look at the impact. So three things. It's, you know, the huge regional disparity, that's one. Second, the level of investment was really minimal to the point where non-existent in many places. And third, the curriculum was basically, you know, focused on basically teaching very little, enough to make young Africans functional, but not enough for them to be able, you know, to move up and socially and in terms of and professionally. So despite this limited investment, the impact was actually impressive. You know, in a paper that I wrote, I show, for instance, that individuals who were educated or who live in a place with school had much better living standard and better social network compared to those living in a place with no school. And those individuals who were educated, they're also, you know, less likely to be farmer. So it means that education creates a degree of economic transformation, structural transformation, occupation diversity. And at the same time, those were more politically active. So this figure shows not only what I just said for the first generation, but also for the second generation. So so despite the limit to education, it's very clear that it changed lives of people who were exposed to it. You know, it changed not only the individual lives, but those are of their family members, but of the community where they live. You know, if you look at a village with school, village without school, what is also interesting is that we observe not only strong intergenerational mobility, but also reduction of income inequality in that place. You know, so while within village, there is a big gap between those with school and those without school, you are a big gap between, you know, so you have a big gap between places with school, places without school. But if you look at places with school, the degree of economic social inequality has reduced. Okay, so talking about inequality, so there are several aspects. One is political inequality. You know, Richard Huguet, you know, from a student from Princeton, showed that regional disparity in political representation in governments were driven by colonial era education provision. You know, cabinet ministers continue to hail disproportionately from areas with high level of colonial education provision. You know, so it shows that regional inequality today were in fact or political lack of divergence, as we say, in political representation, political power of various communities and regions is in part driven in part by investment made in schooling way back. Okay, so Nigeria is a great example of the gap, regional gap. In 1914, Northern Nigeria have 512 total number of students. And Southern Nigeria has 65,000. In 1952, there were 900,000 out of enrolled students out of 2.35 billion. In the North, it's 120,000 out of 2.5 million. So now, one of the interesting parts of the impact that I'm going to be discussing is how education empowered Africans. And I think there is not enough economic research or political science research on this, but I think it will be a great area of investigation. So despite the very severe restriction on supply, Africans saw education as a source of empowerment and demanded more of it. So there is this quote from Davidson in 1970, this quote from a colonial official in Ghana, quoted by, that appeared in Davidson 1973, where he basically said that there was a high motivation, higher drive for education, not only for parents, but also from children. And what is remarkable is the fact that many African intellectuals whose work were really transformative, they barely finished primary or let alone secondary education. One of the, perhaps the best anthropologist or writer that, Francophone Africa has known, Paul Hazoume from Benin, whose book that was published in 1937 called Dokisimi, documented the social and the political life of the Kingdom of Dahomey. He only has basically secondary school education. He was a teacher, but self-taught literature and writing to become, one of the top writers in Francophone Africa. Sembe Ousmane, known as the father of Africa cinema, didn't finish primary school. Actually, what he learned as a member, as a docker in Marseille, and as a member of the Communist Party in France. So, despite the limitations, Africans younger, there was an emerging. The colonial period witnessed the emergence of intellectual elites. So the second strategy that many young Africans use to break the barriers and to resist the colonial restriction in education was actually to connect with African diaspora in the US. A great example is Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of Nigeria, who moved to the US, and finished his education, I think, at UPenn and Columbia, and taught at Lincoln University. He was a journalist. He was also a political scientist, one of the best of the time. And he had a very influential article that he wrote in 1934 that he called How We Should Educate Africans, where he insisted on liberal arts curriculum, that we shouldn't be teaching African just science and agriculture and scientific, but we should also teach African anthropology, ethnology, ethnography, and so on. Obviously, he was also pushing for the expansion and of higher education and even graduate education opportunities for Africa. So the current trend towards vocational training in post-colonial Africa is something that I would say is in sharp contrast with what many African intellectual, African leaders were pushing for, not only pre-World War II, but even particularly post-World War II. Okay, so one also very kind of influential figure was Tovalu Kenom, the nephew of King Béhanzin in Benin, who can be seen here with Marcus Garvey, that shows these connections that the rising African intellectual class, to break from the colonial restriction. One of the key allies that they had were, the civil rights movement or the Black liberation movement in the US. So that's very interesting. So, he was such a figure that he actually married somebody called Roberta Dodd, who was an opera singer, and they lived in Paris until he died in 1938. So, and I will talk later on in one of my presentations, maybe in 2 or 3 weeks, about the emergence of African political elite. This is a picture of the Pan-African Congress in 1945. And I should also stress the fact that it's not just African, basically self-learn or self-taught what they should have learned in high school or at the university. It's not only the fact they connected with African diaspora, it's also the fact that they interacted and they connected with the international socialist movement. And so it's important to notice that education enabled, the emerging elite to break from isolation and connect globally, not only with the US, but also with the international socialist movement. But when they got into power, they actually enacted policies to break from the colonial education policies. One of the great examples is the pre-primary education policy by Chief Obafemi Awolowo in Western Nigeria. So when he got into power in 1952, he basically he enacted a pre-primary education scheme that was considered the biggest expansion of education in colonial Africa, nearly doubling the number of primary schools that was created from 1952 to 1954. And as a result, 50% of children between age of 6 and 12 were beneficiaries of the program. And girls' education benefited massively. And this created positive spillover, not only for the labor market, for the economy. And what is very remarkable is that you can even sense the impact of that policy across the border in Benin. So this is a picture of my primary school, which is right like 2 kilometers away or 3 kilometers away from the Nigerian border. In contrast to most schools in Benin, my class was gender balanced. So it shows that the drive for education, particularly for girls, had an impact even in places where that policy was not implemented. Anyway, so let me finish by giving some key takeaways. So 4 points. The first one is that where education was available, and it was rarely available, it became source of empowerment for Africans. The supply was restricted to the point that colonial education was non-existent, in fact, in most parts of Africa. And the fact that Africans did so much with this little, despite the colonial power to suppress dissent, highlight the transformational power of education on individuals, families, and societies. So historical distortion persists in post-colonial time, therefore, an expansion of the quality education remains a very, very urgent necessity. Thank you very much.
This is a topic of huge significance and significant interest. I think do well to give it the time that it needs. So it was impossible that we would cover all the questions in just one session. And I think there was even a comment in the questions that the framework that you provided in terms of disaggregating the analysis of colonialism and its impact, I think is a very helpful and structured way to go about trying to wrap our minds around this very, very big topic. So really thank you for that intro and setting the scene for the next several sessions that will then address the topic in more depth along those different areas of focus that you outlined. Leonard, thank you. You took us on the first of those deep dives and a really important one. Although I must say, Leonard, I think the highlight of your presentation was the picture of you in primary school.
Thank you.
So that's probably my most memorable moment of the presentation. But maybe just to jump into the questions, they have as always been coming in thick and fast. Huge interest and a lot of different topics coming up through the Q&A. I will apologize in advance to everybody that we will not be able to cover all the questions, despite our best intentions. However, what the team will do at the end of the session is any questions that we have not addressed or any that we have not fully addressed that are relevant and of interest will be attended to by the Wheeler Institute team, and they will make sure that by next week the written answers to those questions are available. However, like I said in reflecting Elias's opening remarks, this is a topic that we are going to deal with over the next several weeks, and so some of these questions I think are going to be addressed or be discussed in more depth in subsequent sessions. So I think we need not despair if we don't get to some of those questions today. So Elias, you started with an intro, and I think some of the questions that came in are more of the overarching questions. And so I'll start with you. There's always going to be a question about the counterfactual. And there's always going to be, that's almost the starting point. But maybe I want to pick up not on the what if it hadn't happened version of the counterfactual, but several questions coming in around the comparative question. Why was the US's development trajectory different? How was South America's development trajectory different? And what can that tell us about what made the Africa experience unique and lead to the outcomes that it led to? Do we have any insights on those types of comparisons?
Thank you, Mamello, and thanks for all your questions. So as you rightly point out, from a purely scientific viewpoint, it's very hard to address the impact of colonization because everybody, in one way or the other, got treated. And let me also say that European countries were also treated, and most likely on the positive side, because they were exploiting the riches, let's say, of Africa or the Potosi silver mines in Latin America. So actually, the treatment could go, the spillovers could be both positive and negative. So it's really, really hard and challenging to come up with an estimate. Oh, colonization had this impact in Nigeria, this much in South Nigeria, this much in North Nigeria. So that's why the framework that economics has tried to apply, as you pointed out, is try to break down this treatment into something that could be studied in a much more coherent manner. Perhaps we can find, quote unquote, some sort of an experiment why a railroad was built here and not another railroad was built there. For example, there's very interesting work that we'll cover next week. So at some point in Gold Coast and Asante, there were two railroads under consideration. One road was built, I think going to Kumasi, the other one was not built. So we can compare what happened to the communities next to the railroad that was built to those that was not built because of some quote unquote random event, and say something meaningful about the effect of railroads, for example. Now, let me also add something to what Leonard pointed out, because I think this has to be clear to our audience. There is going to be research, as Leonard pointed to, that, if you live in, Leonard, I think, is a good example of that. The fact that Leonard was living close to some missionary schools was a good thing. This, of course, should not be confused with the event that Europeans didn't build that many schools in Africa. They didn't build that many railroads and roads. So, even if we document that there are local effects from railroad construction, as next week we will show, this doesn't mean that this was quote unquote so great, because actually a good example that I'm trying to convey to the London Business School students when we discuss about those issues is think about the railroads in the US, that they connect the big cities with each other. And we have fascinating work showing that there was a boom to industrialization. Well, in Africa, the railroads mostly connected the mineral or agricultural-rich interior with a port, because the objective was not to develop, let's say, Mozambique or to develop, Gold Coast, but it was to grab the resources and ship them out. So now, I think what we can keep from this generic question that was reformulated by Atsemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, and Engerman, and Sokolov, and Schleifer, and team, is that we can take this historical approach, go more narrow, better data. Economists need to start talking to political scientists and historians who know much better the case study evidence. We need to talk more to people on the ground who have suffered, and to some who perhaps have gained from those interventions, and then say something meaningful about those issues.
Yeah, thanks very much, Elias. Sticking with you for a moment, a couple of questions are coming in, trying to understand the intent of the colonizing countries for Africa. You spoke earlier about this idea of extractive versus inclusive, the idea of infrastructure development perhaps not having been the priority. Do we have some understanding of what the original intention was and how that impacted on, let's say, colonization strategy, and how that intention may have changed over time, let's say, through the colonization experience and where the outcomes led to?
Yes, so first of all, that's a great question. And let me say that my answer will be very general, and it will differ from region, not even country, like region to region. But I think in a nutshell, Europeans, quote unquote, rediscover Africa, roughly speaking, 1860, 1890, when commodity prices are at all-time high. We speak nowadays about commodities being very high. This is actually the time when in global history, commodities are at all-time high, because of big industrialization, in North America, in Europe, and some other parts of the world. So suddenly Europeans become interested in Africa that they hadn't even explored at the time, because there is this presumption that it's natural resource rich. Natural resource rich doesn't necessarily mean gold and diamond. This was clearly part of it, but it meant also cotton, wild rubber, much needed in the beginning, and then cultivated rubber. So Europeans actually, big picture changes, because now they see Africa, they used to see Africa as a place of labor, as Nathan discussed in the slave trade. And now suddenly it became a place that we had to extract resources. They wanted to keep investments at a minimum. So they didn't like that the metropole would subsidize the colonies. They tried it in the beginning, but it turned out to be very unprofitable. So then they started thinking out of ways that the colonies would run quote unquote balanced budgets, to put it in contemporary language. So how could this happen? So one modus operandi would be, let's say the King Leopold's idea. Let's bring in concessionaries, Europeans or others, give them big pieces of land, let them do what they were doing, allow them to be very oppressive and coercive, and hopefully get some revenue, some royalties. In some other cases, it would be to tax directly the Africans, or some hybrid of the two. And then, actually, this goes back to Leonard's intervention, education, perhaps health, let's try to, quote unquote, again, to use the contemporary jargon, outsource. Many Christians felt really awful about the preceding slave trades. So, they came to the so-called slave belt in West Africa. So, let them build schools. I think from the viewpoint of the colonial administration was that it was less costly for them. So this would be, roughly speaking, and then the railroad was limited investment because the objective, again, was to get, let's say, the cotton and ship it out, and perhaps tax a bit the export or the company that was engaged in this export. It was never the idea of Europeans, very sadly and very unfortunately, to develop the colonies, at least in the early stage.
Mm. And Leonard, if I can ask you to pick up on that, I mean, and maybe just double click a bit on this point around, therefore, was there kind of a change in strategy, a change in intent, and what impact that had, therefore, on the investments in human capital, both in terms of the method as well as in terms of the quantum invested in that space?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again? I forgot, I didn't hear the beginning of the question, please.
Apologies. So the question was around, or originally we started with Elias talking about the intent of colonial masters initially as they came onto the continent, and did that intent change, and did that change their strategy in terms of how they started to engage with these various parts of the continent, and as that intent, whatever the original intent was, which was really mostly extractive, and as that perhaps evolved over time, did that have an impact on both the quantum and the method and even the quality of human capital investment?
So, no, that's a great question. So 2 things. So first of all, I think that the intention has not changed, really. What has changed is the political dynamics in the metropole. Like, for instance, in France, for a long time, the leftists were in power, and they were better allies of Africans, particularly the emerging African elites, than the right wing. I mean, the Front Populaire, the Popular Front in France was actually made of communist, so that's an important element. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that, especially post-1945, the emerging African elites were breaking barriers. They were pushing, for university to be created, secondary school to be created. And so this demand led to a shift in strategy. So I will not say that they changed strategy, because we were forced to, in fact, adapt. But then the adaptation was even not much, because by 1950, only few countries have more than 20% primary school enrollment rate, So I think that progress that were made because Africans wanted it. And I think it's something that we don't stress enough, like I have, I have a student of one of my students from African School of Economics just got into UBC, the PhD program at UBC, which is, especially after Nathan and all the other colleagues moved there, it's a massive, massive achievement. But this guy, his mother is a subsistence farmer from a small village in central Cameroon. But she set the bar so high for his son that PhD, no less, So, and I think this kind of drive, this demand for education that force the colonial administration to open up more opportunity for Africans, and the fact that the emerging political elite, made education reform a central piece of their agenda, I think it's something that really should be stressed far more than the fact that, some people or some situation in colonial metropole make them, change a little bit their initial intents on Africa. Yeah.
Leonard, a little bit later, I'd like to actually come back to the intent and aspirations of the early African elites who benefited from education. But before we do that, if I can just maybe discuss some questions that take us a couple of steps back to say, what do we know about education in Africa pre-colonialism? What can we say about, again, a counterfactual, I suppose, what we believe could have happened if those education systems were allowed to thrive and to persist? And what do we know about, let's say, I don't know what the right word to use is, but maybe non-Western modes or models of education? For example, what we know about Islamic schools that were established, was the impact there different in terms of outcomes?
Yeah, it's an extremely interesting question at two levels. First of all, we don't know enough about, first of all, the pre-colonial education system. Obviously, they did exist. At some level, it's very kind of practical in terms of learning skills, in agriculture, in arts, in medicine, how to deal with somebody who breaks his leg or something, or her leg. There were mechanisms to transmit this knowledge. To give you one example, until today, in my home village, there is something called a zonini, which means it's a ceremony to chase disease. And it's basically a regional convention of traditional healers, where before there are ways to deal with some disease, after they share knowledge, and they make this knowledge available to the community as a whole. At night, we have to stay inside. If we get inside, we can be hurt. But in fact, it's because they may be afraid that they are manipulating very dangerous disease. Things that could spread disease. Because things like smallpox and many things were known in traditional Africa. But unfortunately, there is not enough research on this, and there is not enough way to integrate this past knowledge in current curriculum in Africa. That's something that needs to be done. So we don't know, unfortunately, because the colonial administration made sure that there is a complete disconnect between the endogenous knowledge that have been developed and modern knowledge. But there is something about education that, at some point, people demanded education because they liked the opportunity to socialize, they liked the opportunity to learn new things, the opportunity to give them to connect with others. Obviously, that was not enough. And that's why, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of Nigeria, he made teaching African history, teaching anthropology, ethnography, a central piece of a modern education reform. So the question shouldn't be just about what could have happened. It's something that we need to learn more about, but it should be more practical. How do we teach local languages, local culture, past knowledge in various areas into the curriculum so that we try to catch up on what we have missed for so long?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that reflection. I think it's a very important point now that, when I look at young activists today in South Africa, for example, who are demanding decolonization of education, which has become a very popular term. And although it might mean different things to different people, there is this sense of wanting to dig back and recapture some of the richness that was deliberately cut off, from what was considered legitimate education at the time. Exactly.
No, I think make this as a part of the decolonization education movement is a positive step. Because, let me say, I will be, it's not about rejecting Western education because, those people in the 30s and 40s wanted more of it. You know, they said, don't just teach us first grade stuff, teach us university stuff. You know, so, but then it should be about, and what they thought about is, okay, let's use that, let's build on it. Let's confront it with the knowledge that we have developed, that knowledge that we are going to develop. So the key point is it's call to action for us to do more research in this area and to push government to reform in such a way that, you know, like traditional medicine, traditional, like plants, or even many things that has to do with, you know, science and sociology, you know, social science and philosophy from the past, you know, is integrated in curriculum and studied. But then the point here is that well, let's not waste time to see what we should take and what we shouldn't take. It's an individual decision to make, but it should be more about building a momentum for curriculum change, you know, so that at secondary school level, primary school level, university level, not only local languages are taught, but local knowledge in science, technology, in arts and things are taught, you know, at the highest level. Let's integrate those knowledge, for instance, in all part of society. Like, for instance, tourism in Africa shouldn't be like tourism in Dubai, you know, it shouldn't be like tourism in Russia or whatever, you know. There should be some culture, but who is going to bring that in? Who is going to, it shouldn't be other people. So let's, okay, so I think I'm clear enough. So I completely agree with you. I think it's a very important topic. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Elias, it looked like you wanted to jump in there.
Yes, I wanted to add a remark here because it touches also close. This issue touches my heart, and I know Nathan's and Stelios. When we put up this curriculum, we view this initiative as one effort towards this objective. We want to identify areas like the great questions that we have received. As we have repeatedly mentioned, we do not know as much as we wanted about pre-colonial Africa. So hopefully this will lead more people in the ground to do more African researchers, to do more research there. And the way at least we view, I think I speak on behalf of all four of us here, we want to have a synthesis. We want to put things together. We can take things, you know, from Africans that for many years we have neglected. That was the big mistake, with, you know, the insights that we all have from South Africa, from Benin, from Canada, from Greece, from everywhere. So we truly believe that this initiative, the next step will be more of this integrated, synthetic kind of approach.
No, I couldn't agree more. I want to try and stitch together a number of themes, and I'm going to kind of address both of you with the questions, but really around this theme of resistance.
Yeah.
Elias, you spoke about how there was potentially some relationship between the reaction of African indigenous people to the colonizers that shaped some of the strategy and the outcomes in that regard, perhaps not always in a way that was intended or in a way that one would have expected. Can you share more about the impacts of that? So that's one of the sort of set of questions. And then Leonard, if I think of resistance now in the later years, in the years where you see the emergence of the African political elite, you talked about some of their aspirations as they came back, especially those who've been educated abroad, came back with massive aspirations around how to transform education, how to transform the economy, how to, you know, and I suppose this was one of the fears of the colonizers as they thought about education and its impact. But there's a sense that some of those aspirations never really materialized. What happened?
That's a great question. So I think there were, I can point to two or three possible causes. I think many of them did not fully embrace democracy. under the influence of socialism and communism. You know, like it was in the 60s, it was very difficult to resist the temptation of the East, you know, because they were saying all the right things, they were very transformative. You hear stories about, you know, very poor people in Romania becoming like general in the army, you know, I mean, it's very, and the idea of revolution, you know, leftist revolution was very attractive. So but then many of them went into the trap of abandoning freedom and democracy. And I think the tragic example is the the years of Nkrumah, you know, from 1963 to 1966, where he did, you know, a number of things that, you know, so that's one reason. But I think another reason, I mean, another aspect of the Cold War was, you know, push for violence, you know, like trouble everywhere, you know, like when a lot of suspicion, Lumumba, for instance, if he's not with you, then he's the East, then you try to topple him, you know, create trouble and stuff, you know. This led to the lost decades of 60 to the 70s. But, you know, maybe another element that I can also point to is the fact that the institutions, the post-colonial institutions, were still very young. You know, many of them were copy-paste from colonial. So, and unfortunately, is that we haven't learned enough from the 60s. So I'm not seeing enough innovation and political institutions in Africa. You know, I'm not even seeing enough, for instance, innovation in education in Africa. You know, so people from the 50s, they have the excuse that they didn't know enough. They were trapped by the attraction of communism, you know. But today we don't have that excuse. So that's why I think that it's really important that the new emerging young African intelligentsia, they understand that we should do things in a novel manner. We should always think about innovating new institutions, new things, decentralization, introduction of local language and curriculum, whether Bill Gates paid for that or not, whether you know, they paid for it or not. Let's take the ambition of those from the 50s into reality, because we're facing a lot of constraints, you know, international level, domestic level, that made it impossible for them to achieve. I mean, make it difficult for them to achieve. But yet, some countries did better than others. I mean, Kenya, for instance, did slightly better than Congo, and Mauritius better than Madagascar. You know, so we should learn from those experiences. Why there are few places where in the 60s things actually did work, or much better than other places. Learn from it so that now we can maybe don't repeat the same mistakes, and we can do things in a way that actually make this dream of our the first leader a reality.
Yeah, thank you. I don't even want to respond, because we could then kick off another discussion for another 2 hours, Leonard. This is just so rich and so compelling. But we've come to that time when we do need to wrap up. So Elias, I'm going to hand back to you for sort of your thoughts, concluding remarks, and to wrap us up for the evening. But before I do that, I think no discussion on colonization is ever going to run without this question. And I don't want you to answer it, but I'd like to leave it for all of us to kind of reflect on, think about, and maybe we debate it in the plenary sessions that come later. But there is this persistent question, and very divisive question, I might say. Were there any benefits to colonization? Should Africans be grateful for having been colonized? Those who kind of know South African political current affairs will know that how that question became, you know, just a massively divisive one a few years ago, but it persists. Yeah, and sometimes it comes with a strong political undertone and a bit of a political agenda. But I think it's a question that we're going to see every time. And it's come up today more than once. So something for us to just think about, reflect on, and have some courageous conversations in addressing.
Thank you, Mamello. Thank you very much for such a great moderation and your remarks. Again, here, we will touch upon these issues again, especially the last session with Joe Heinrich, who is one of the world's most prominent psychologists. I think we'll discuss a bit about this issue again. Nathan also discussed a bit during his session in lecture 2. And let me also say here that clearly colonization is something deeply traumatized to the people of Africa and many others. So what economists effectively are doing is doing a much narrower kind of question, at least initially, what has been the effect, on consumption or education or health. Although, to be fair to my great colleagues, Leonard being one and Nathan being another one, we study more and more issues related to trust, psychology, civicness, values, and how important citizens think democracy is. So we will be returning to those issues. And let me use your question to say that tomorrow we will zoom into the role of Christian missions. We have 3 great speakers who have done very important work and very innovative work: Roland Pungu, Etienne Rossignol from the London Business School, and Catherine Gurkinger. And actually tomorrow we'll also discuss issues related to gender, an issue that Leonard touched upon, which couldn't be more topical because today we celebrate International Women's Day. And let me also remind all of us the amazing remarks of Chris Ehret from the very beginning, saying that the role of women was actually considerably stronger in many African pre-colonial societies vis-a-vis other parts of the world. And again, let me quote Leonard that we want to learn more about those issues, and clearly more research is needed on those spot-on and very fascinating questions with profound policy importance today. So I hope to see you all tomorrow. Let me also flag that the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development, we have launched, and we will have our first meeting on Thursday, a climate initiative with a focus actually on emerging markets with my great colleague Lucrezia Reichlin, professor of economics at the London Business School, former chief economist of the European Central Bank. And Lucrezia will have 5 discussions with prominent policymakers about, for example, how we can go to net zero emissions and various very topical issues. So perhaps those of you who are interested, can also join us for more events, although I understand that this course has been very intensive by itself. So thanks a lot for being with us today. We hope to see you tomorrow. Let me repeat the usual things that the lecture slides have already been uploaded. You can also see on the course website the Q&A from the last week, and also the videos. Today's video will be uploaded something 6 days from now, and we will have also the first assessment will be about to be released. This is for those who want to get a letter of participation for the course. Leonard, Nathan, Stelios, and I drafted some questions. We look forward to your answers, and we really hope that you continue engaging with us with your emails and your questions. Thanks a lot, Bing Time, for being with us. Thanks.